What we're doing for the rest of today, now that we finished reviewing exams, is we're going to be talking spinal control of movement. And that's, I'm not sure, we'll see how far we get in this chapter, but we made pretty good headway last week. So I am anticipating that we'll be able to do homework discussion on chapter 13 on Wednesday. This is a little bit of a shorter chapter, in part because we're skipping all the cross-bridge cycling stuff that is in your book, but again, I just don't feel like that's neuro, so I don't want to really spend time on it because you get in other chapters or other classes. So Wednesday we'll do the homework on chapter 13, which is the original date that it was scheduled for when I posted it. And then Friday, I do think we're going to be able to start into chapter 14, which is very tightly linked to this one. Chapter 14 is brain control of movement. So we kind of start off with these two discrete chapters that are going to be dedicated to understanding how we initiate motions and actions and execute them. Also, just as a reminder, many people have been emailing about this, and I'm sorry if you've emailed me this morning. I've gotten like 20 emails, and I have been in meetings or other things teaching since about 10 to 10 this morning. So I have not been able to answer many emails, but a lot of people are scheduling times. That's great. At this point, I would recommend that you send me an email and let me know heads up that you're coming, because office hours are getting kind of packed. That doesn't mean I don't want to meet with you. I just, it probably, unless you want to stand outside my office for a half hour, 45 minutes, you might want to just make sure that there's going to be time. But we should meet and talk about outlines as soon as possible. I think I probably said by the end of this week-ish. If it happens next week, that really will be okay. I just wanted to get it done before, you're sitting there just about to do the writing. And the writing, does have to be done by mid-April. So I think it'd be good to get it in as soon as possible. But again, if schedule fills up and it's not possible this week, then we'll certainly just make sure we get it done next week. But please don't forget to do that, because you do get points for your outlines when you meet with me. So any questions about anything else, like that sort of thing, like course-related mumbo jumbo? Okay, so I think where we left off is we were talking about how is it that we can deal with the system where one action potential that arrives at a skeletal muscle causes it to do a little twitch. So if that's the way things work, that it's, individual little twitches are being generated by skeletal muscles in response to input from the nervous system, how is it that we can instead have prolonged, constant, graceful sorts of contractions of our muscles? We're not twitching all the time, and we can vary the force of contraction in dramatic ways. And one of the ways, I'm going to scroll back, one of the ways we can do that is via this process of temporal summation. So we don't just send one impulse to skeletal muscles. Instead, we send a barrage of impulses to skeletal muscles. And by repeatedly stimulating skeletal muscle before it has the opportunity to completely relax, we can achieve either sort of intermediate or extremely forceful contractions that will allow us to have, over extended periods of time and at varying levels of contractile force, different kinds of contractions in our muscles. And again, this is also only what's happening in sort of like one muscle fiber, or at least one motor unit at a time. And other motor units will be sort of off sync of that and will allow for nice, smooth, continuous sorts of contractions. So we don't really experience this because we've got other other motor units that are sort of off phase from it, and they kind of absorb that jerkiness. Another thing that we can do in order to regulate, especially force of contraction, has to do with the kinds of motor unit stimulation we're producing. So if you remember, motor units are a individual motor neuron, and then all of the skeletal muscle fibers that particular motor neuron innervates. So in that way, each of those motor units functions as sort of like a little collection of muscle cells that are all going to fire at the same time. And we don't just have one of those per muscle organ. Instead, we'll have dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of those motor units per muscle organ. So per biceps muscle, or per erector spinae muscle. And so we can regulate how many of those things are firing at once, in addition to how long each individual one is firing and that kind of thing. And that's what this experiment is trying to show. So this graph is an experiment. I'm going to sort of walk you through the experiment because I think it then helps to illustrate how things would happen in real life. So in this case, we do have a muscle dangling between a force transducer and a metal plate, and we've got the nerve dissected out, and we've hooked that nerve up to an electrode that we can vary the stimulus voltage on. You can kind of imagine that by varying the stimulus voltage, we're kind of mimicking how strongly the central nervous system, the spinal cord, is stimulating that nerve that's leading to this particular muscle. And this is kind of how it works. If you only deliver a tiny little bit of voltage into the nerve, what ends up happening is that nerve is not sufficiently stimulated to get those motor neurons up to threshold. Therefore, they don't fire an action potential. That's what's happening here and here, is you're delivering a stimulus. And the amount of stimulus is being reported on the y-axis here. But in this case, it's just a pittance of a stimulus. It's, a millivolt or two, and it's just not enough to get those motor neurons up to threshold. Here, you're continuing to deliver a little bit more stimulus, but it's still not enough to get anything up to threshold. But in experiment 3 here, you dial up the dial just a little bit more, and you deliver a little bit more stimulus, and as a result, you finally get up to threshold, which means that a few of the motor neurons that are present within that nerve and are going down to the muscle are now being stimulated up to threshold, and they start firing a barrage of action potentials. Not just one, but probably a barrage of them that will cause temporal summation in all their skeletal muscle fibers. The response of this is measured down here in tension. So this is just measuring the force that little muscle is generating. And again, the first two, we didn't get up to threshold, and so there's no force of contraction that's generated because no action potentials went down to the skeletal muscles, and therefore they didn't get stimulated to contract. The same happened in number 2. In number 3, though, we finally got up to threshold, which is enough that at least some of the motor neurons are getting stimulated, which means some of the motor units are being recruited, we say, in order to contract, and we're generating a tiny bit of tension, just a little, because it turns out we only stimulated a few of the motor units. However, as we move through the experiment and we continuously increase the stimulus intensity, so how much current we're injecting into the nerve that is then leading to the skeletal muscle, if we provide a little bit more voltage, we end up getting a little bit more tension. And if we provide a little bit more, we get even more, and so on and so on and so on, until we get to this point. So in number 7, we hit this stimulus that does cause an increase in tension, but if we go a little bit higher stimulus than this, so we're really cranking up the dial at this point to a really high stimulus value, we get to this point where any higher stimulation of the axons, or of the nerve rather, that contains lots of neurons and axons, we get to a sort of a maximal point of contraction at this point. So at this point, this muscle can't be stimulated to contract any higher, even if we continue to deliver increased voltage. Now, what happened, right? So what we're seeing on the outside is that increased stimulus that we provide onto the muscle results in increased tension being generated by the muscle, at least up to a certain point. But if we try to figure out mechanistically what has happened, why are we getting, first, why are we getting this increase in tension for increased stimulus? And then why does it top out up here? It turns out it does seem to have to do directly with which motor units are being recruited within the axon. No, let me say it again. Which motor units are being recruited within the nerve? And I'm sorry. So a nerve contains lots of axons, right? So in the first two, none of the motor units, so none of the motor neurons were stimulated up to threshold. So none of them were firing action potentials. And so what this is trying to show you is how many of the axons present within this nerve were stimulated to fire action potentials. And right here, it's showing none of them are colored red, so that indicates that none of them were stimulated, and therefore we generated zero tension. In experiment 3, trial 3 here, we did get up to threshold, at least for some of the motor neurons. We delivered just enough stimulus to get, in this case, they're showing one motor unit got excited. So that means one motor neuron that's leading to a collection of skeletal muscle cells within the muscle organ got up to threshold, fired some action potentials. Those resulted then in contraction of just a small number of skeletal muscle fibers down in the muscle. If we dialed up our stimulus a little bit more, we're starting to get increasingly larger numbers, though, of motor neurons, and therefore larger numbers of motor units of skeletal muscle fibers excited. So we see gradually increased tension. So here we're stimulating enough to get 2 motor units going, we get more force. Now we've got 4 motor units going in number 5, we get more force, and so on and so on and so on. Until we get to number 7. Number 7, at this point, we've got enough input stimulus that we're getting all the different motor neurons to fire at once. If they're all firing, that means that all of the skeletal muscle fibers within that muscle organ are also simultaneously firing. And so there's really nothing more you can do. You can deliver more input voltage, but at this point, you've successfully stimulated every single motor unit, every single motor neuron present within that nerve. And as a result, we hit sort of a maximal force of contraction. Every single skeletal muscle fiber at this point has been stimulated to fire because every single motor unit that leads to that muscle has been stimulated to fire. So that's the experiment. Does that make sense in terms of what you did, what we were sort of doing with a little frog muscle dangling off force transducers with a wire electrode attached to its nerve? That's the thing. Yeah. Ooh. Yes. Okay, so I guess the question is it possible for us to damage ourselves if we hit maximal force of contraction? Yes. And I'd say the answer is yes. And then I want to get back to that when we get to the Golgi tendon organs, because it directly feeds into that, that question. But in this case, really, like, the goal here, my major goal, is just to try to understand what's happening as we increase contractile force at a muscle level. So if I'm trying to pick up this dilly little clicker thing, I don't really need to stimulate a ton of motor units in order to get that to happen. It's not a very heavy object. I can just make this, make this increase. Whereas if instead I wanted to lift the table, I really am having to probably engage just about all of my motor units in order to make that happen, especially because I'm a weakling. If you were a stronger person, maybe that wouldn't be the case. But the idea is that I can vary my contractile strength in large part by varying how many motor units I stimulate. In terms of how it actually happens biologically, it's not so much that we're increasing a stimulus voltage, but the effect is kind of the same. We're increasing the numbers of upper motor neurons that are stimulating the lower motor neurons that are housed within this nerve to fire. So the more motor units we get going, the greater force of contraction will generate, at least until we get to a maximal force of contraction. Yeah?
The same, like in the lesser weights and stuff, the same motor neurons fire at the same time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there is a pattern. So, and that's actually right where we're going. So it's a beautiful transition. So it is actually non-random in terms of which ones get recruited first, which motor units get recruited first, and which ones start to fire later. So usually what happens is that if you start with just a small force of contraction, under those circumstances, it's typically the smallest of the motor units that get excited first. And by size of motor unit, when I'm saying smallest motor units, I'm talking about the motor units that are hooked up to the smallest number of skeletal muscle fibers. So that's basically what it's showing here. So the first recruits, the first motor units that get recruit are usually, they're very easily excited and they're very small. So these are narrower axons. And the key thing, though, is that they have fewer muscle fibers associated with them. So you may have some motor units within that are going to your biceps that are stimulating 30 muscle fibers. Others may be stimulating 300 muscle fibers. The ones that only go to 30 muscle fibers tend to get recruited first. They're the most easily excitable of the motor neurons, and that results in that small population getting recruited first. The later recruits tend to be the largest of the motor units. Those are the ones that you only really engage when you need to really just generate a ton of force. And we do very different things with our arm. We tend to do more, very precise types of actions that are involving small motor units because, in those cases you want to have really fine control and, good coordination. Whereas when you're engaging these really big motor units, there you're just trying to generate force. You're trying to lift the frickin' table off the floor using that arrangement. Okay, so we call this the size principle, where you'll have gradually increasing numbers of gradually increased size of motor units recruited as you try to generate more and more force. So you're recruiting to make more force, like we're showing here. You are recruiting more motor units, but you're also finally to get to that maximal force, you're finally recruiting the largest of the motor units as well. Now, in addition, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
So how do you become stronger? Like, does that happen?
Yeah, well, a big part of, so if you go from my state, which is never exercising, to actually exercising, what would happen in large part is hypertrophy of the individual muscle fibers themselves. So the muscle fibers start to put in more of the little contractile filaments. Each muscle cell basically adds more contractile filaments, so each muscle cell becomes stronger. You can get some changes or increases in the performance of your motor units as a whole, I think, but I think a lot of the changes actually are happening more at sort of like that muscle cell level. So that could go from a state where, like, my largest motor units, maybe each motor unit is lifting, I don't know, 20 pounds or something amongst my largest ones. So maybe my largest motor units might start to perform such they could lift 40 pounds if I, start exercising. So each motor unit kind of counts for more, and as a result, you become stronger. There's one other cool thing that can happen in that it's not purely just sort of a sequence where light contractions results in smallest motor units, because usually we're not, powering at maximal force of contraction. It's pretty rare, frankly, on a day-to-day basis that we are actually engaging our muscles at our strongest force of contraction. Usually, instead of being way up here, we're tending to operate somewhere in this range, right? I mean, how often, except when you go to the gym, are you really trying your hardest to contract a given muscle? It doesn't happen real often. So what also will happen is that while you're doing sustained exercise or just walking around, and you've got all your your abdominal and back muscles that are constantly in a state of contraction to keep you upright, what you're doing there is you're not actually stimulating the same motor units all the time. They kind of take turns. So one will kind of run for a while, maybe this one will go for a while, and then it starts to fatigue, so it shuts down, but at the same time a different one will kind of get stimulated and start to take over. So in that way we can kind of have our motor units take turns, and so we prevent whole muscle fatigue by giving our motor units a break, giving our our little collections of muscle fibers a break now and then. And that's usually going to be the case, except when you start to really try to engage maximally. And that's why when you start to engage at maximal force of contraction, you do fatigue pretty quickly. Because you don't have the opportunity to allow your motor units to take turns if they all have to be engaged to generate the force that you're asking them to. Okay? I think that stuff's really interesting. All right. Other things that can happen in terms of how do we have different amounts of force being generated and different performances of different kinds of in different states. So one thing that's also interesting about motor units is that they can vary not just in their size, but also in their speed and also in their fatigue resistance. So you may have had, if you have taken physiology courses before, probably talked about fast twitch versus slow twitch fibers, or the fast glycolytic versus the slow oxidative fibers is the other term. That's usually what I call them in A&P. Our motor units also vary in that same kind of way. So though we have what are referred to as fast motor units, where a fast motor unit would be a motor neuron that's sending signals predominantly to fast twitch muscle fibers. So in this case, those muscle fibers would be larger and stronger, faster. They also fatigue more quickly. There's sort of an interesting trade-off that happens there between the fast twitch versus the slow oxidative fibers. I tend to think of these as more like the sprinter or the explosive weightlifter type muscles. And they are being fed by motor neurons that have really large axon diameters that allows for low internal resistance and really fast conduction. And they can produce short-term massive barrages of action potentials. So if you look over here, if you look at one individual burst of force, what you end up seeing is that these fast motor units, here they're labeled as fast fatigable, generate massive amounts of force that can twitch or engage and then release very, very quickly. But what you end up seeing is that if you continue to engage them over time, so these numbers are in minutes over here, these fast fatigable ones generate a massive amount of force initially, but then they fatigue pretty quickly. So here we are, we're generating, I don't know, it looks like something like 70 grams of force in whatever this muscle prep happens to be. But this particular motor unit, by the time you get to 2 minutes, it's pretty much petered out. I mean, these fast fatigable ones just don't last very long. In contrast, we also have slow motor units that feed into what are called slow oxidative fibers, where the muscle fibers tend to be smaller and they contract more slowly and they don't generate as much force, but they're also very oxidative. They're loaded with mitochondria, they're loaded with myoglobin, so they can store lots of oxygen. They're very good at avoiding any signs of fatigue and contracting over and over and over again for very long periods of time. So I tend to think of these as sort of like the distance runner style muscle. And these kinds of muscles, the slow oxidative fibers, are fed by they're parts of slow motor units which have different neurons that lead to them. So here they're showing motor neurons tend to have smaller axon diameters. They have slower conduction velocities, not massively slower. It's not like they're taking multiple seconds to get to the target, but they are moving a little bit more slowly. They don't send as rapid of barrages of action potentials, so maybe only 10 to 20 hertz, so that'd be 10 to 20 per second instead of 30 to 60 hertz. And each one tends to result in a slower, less dramatic sort of contraction. So here they're showing a twitch from a slow motor unit, and you've got, it doesn't generate much force, but it's off the ground for a pretty long period of time, right? So I mean, we're generating force over 250 milliseconds instead of being basically over and done with within 150. And they're not generating that much force, so this is measuring as a whole for the muscle organ itself. They're only generating 4 grams of force instead of 70 here, but they don't really seem to fatigue. So here we are 6 minutes on, 60 minutes on, and they're still generating force because they're very resistant to fatigue. That's sort of kind of their specialty. That's what they do. And then we have some that are in between, which I don't even put up here, but just so you're aware, these are called fast fatigue resistance, which again, they're just kind of intermediate. So the individual twitches are more force than slow oxidative fibers, less force than fast fatigable fibers. They do last quite a bit longer, but they do eventually fatigue. So here at 6 minutes, they're starting to arc down. By 50 minutes, they're pretty much done. So we have some that are kind of in between too. But again, the idea is we have varieties of different muscle cells, and each of those muscle cells tend to be associated with different kinds of motor neurons. And so we get whole motor units that tend to be more endurance specialists or fast twitch, explosive force types of specialist motor units. Make sense? Okay. So what I've tried to do with that section is just try to talk about what are the interactions between the our lower motor neurons, the motor neurons that originate out of our spinal cord and go to our skeletal muscles, and the ways in which they specifically are then interacting with the muscle cells to cause varying kinds of performances, be it long, extended, graded contractions or explosive contractions that are very strong, or more fatigue-resistant types of motions. What's left within the chapter are sort of 2 topics. One is we want to kind of come back to the sensory stuff that we've been putting off and talk about proprioception. And then after that, we'll come back to some circuit ideas and talk about pattern generators. We won't get there today, but we'll start into the proprioception stuff right now. Okay, so as we are using our skeletal muscles, we need to be able to sense what they're doing. If all we're doing is sending output from our central nervous system to the skeletal muscles, we're not monitoring what they're doing, we're losing the ability to do really tight control. I think that intuitively kind of makes sense. If you need to really tightly coordinate and control the types of actions you're trying to perform, you need to be able to sense what your muscles are doing. So the way in which we do that is through a whole suite of proprioceptors. And these include the 2 main ones that we're going to talk about are muscle spindle organs as well as Golgi tendon organs, but there are others as well. So for example, there are some associated with all of our joints that basically tell us something about the angle each of our joints are currently being held at. There's other kinds of proprioceptors associated with muscles as well, but we're going to hit those main 2 kinds because, in part they're cool. There are discrete reflexes associated with them, and they've been really well studied. So we'll start with these ones. They're called muscle spindles. If you look individually within a skeletal muscle. So again, we're sort of focusing on the bicep in this picture. So here's your biceps brachii, and embedded within the biceps brachii would be a set of really small little muscle spindle organs. They look like little sheathed capsules. So it's almost like there's almost like a little cyst where you've got a little connective tissue sheath that's wrapped around it. It's called a fibrous capsule. And then housed within that are a series of muscle cells and lots of neurons and sensory endings. And the goal of this device, so to put it up here, our goal for this device is that we want to be able to use this to detect any changes that occur in the length of our muscle. So we have an idea of what our muscle is doing at any given moment, and then that's fed into or associated with lots and lots of reflexes. So ultimately what I'm going to try to show, and I'm out of time so I'm going to have to stop, but what I'm going to try to show is how it is that when you're sitting at a doctor's office and you know the doctor comes up and she hits your knee with a hammer and causes you to have that little reflexive twitch, ultimately what you're doing is you're stimulating these Golgi tendon, or not Golgi, these muscle spindle organs and causing a reflexive kind of action. So we want to understand how they are detecting changes in muscle length, and then ultimately what the goal of that is, because it's not so that you twitch your leg out whenever you get hit in the knee with a hammer. They do something more important than that. All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.